مساء الخير. انتصار مرسي لم يستطع أن يهدئ الخوف بين المصريين ولا أن يضبط الجيش. محمد مرسي ليس ثوريا ولا وطنيا كفاية. النخبة في الجيش نصبت له الأفخاخ. فقط الجيش ضمن الفوز في الانتخابات المصرية. هذا بعض ما كتبه روبرت فيسك الكاتب المعروف في صحيفة الاندبندنت البريطانية عن مصر. أما في سوريا فكتب أن الاتفاق الغربي يمكن أن يترك سوريا بين يدي الأسد لسنتين إضافيتين. وفي لبنان فهو لا يتوقف عن الكتابة عن أي مدى يخاف على لبنان مما يجري في سوريا. الليلة حلقة خاصة مع الكاتب روبرت فيسك مخصصة للحديث عن مقالاته وما رآه في زياراته العديدة ولقاءاته في مختلف الدول العربية، وكيف يقرأ واقع العالم العربي في ظل اليقظة التي يعيشها. البداية من مصر ومع الكاتب روبرت فيسك. أهلا وسهلا فيك مرة جديدة بترانزيت. طبعا بدي بلش من موضوع مصر وانتصار محمد مرسي. أنت قلت يعني أنه مرسي اليوم انتصر، ولكن تتحدث عن خوف المصريين. لماذا يخاف المصريون من مرسي؟
Well, I tell you, my sources told me that Morsi was in great danger of losing the election. And the military council were very frightened that if he lost it and Ahmed and his opponent won the election, that the people in Tahrir would rise up again. So what my Shafiq, in fact, I was told, did by a small amount win the election. But in fact, it was given to Morsi, and Shafiq accepted that. And I think it was the fear of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, as they call themselves, that they would not be able to control Egypt unless Morsi became the president. But as I say, my sources say that Morsi just lost that election, but he is the president. But the amazing thing is how calm it has been since he was made president, how the streets have calmed down. Nobody's expecting the military to take over as they were beforehand. It's a great sign of the maturity of Egyptians that they wanted to participate in something democratic. But it was a great sign of the immaturity of the army that they dissolved parliament before he became the president. I think the revolution in Egypt is still going on. It's still continuing. It's not finished yet.
بواحد من مقالاتك يعني تحدثت عن أنه في ثعلب موجود بميدان التحرير. من هو هذا الثعلب؟ ومش بالضرورة تقلنا اسمه يعني، ولكن أن تقول عن مدى أهمية هذا الشخص ومعلوماته اللي تحدثت عنها.
Well, I used the word of fox so that I did not have to tell you who he was. Okay, it is a male, it's a man, all right? And he does have a bullet wound in his leg. That when I mentioned the fox has a bullet wound in its paw, that was true. The reason I called him the fox was very simply that I could not get all the sources I needed to confirm the story I was writing. But I thought that the reader should know what I'm hearing. So I told it as a story of an animal fable. Foxes are not always trustworthy and they're very nasty to chickens. And I know that in the Arab world, people love fables about animals, as we do in the West, of course. So I thought I would tell the story and use the fox as my source. I've never used an animal name before. Taleb min Midan Tahrir. And funnily enough, a lot of Egyptians have been talking about the fox, thinking it's a real fox. It's not, it's only got 2 legs, it doesn't have 4. But it's interesting the way that it got picked up. But quite a lot of people were actually telling me a very similar tale to what the fox was telling me. Part of that story is that the military in Egypt appear to be split between young intelligence officers, who are the young new military class, and the old generals, who, as we know, if not actually corrupt, have been making a lot of money because the army controls about 1/3 of the Egyptian economy, including shopping malls and land and real estate. So I think what was really important in the story I wrote, what I felt was important, was not who won or who did not win the election, but the split between the young officer class within the Egyptian army and the older generals who are enjoying the fruits of old age by making a lot of money.
مرسي إلى جانب من؟
I think Morsi is on everybody's side. He'll play his cards right because there has always been a relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and the army in Egypt. There has always been a parallel, a contact point between them. And, you know, it's only in the West that we oh, Muslim Brotherhood, as if this terrible dark secret society, when in fact it's had more than 80 years of history. And I mean, the British were talking to the Brotherhood before the Second World War. You know, there's a long history to the Ikhwan. And I think that people like Morsi, they'll be on everybody's side to see if they can just stay where they are. Although, one of the things I was being told is that there may be more elections in a year's time and Morsi may not win next time. As I said before, this is a revolution that still continues. It doesn't have a full stop on it. We journalists like to have full stops on our reports, but it doesn't have.
ولكن روبرت، يعني أنت أيضا بواحد من مقالاتك تتحدث نقلت عن خوف المسيحيين من وصول مرسي، ونقلت عن ناس التقيت فيهم عن خوف من وصول مرسي. يعني لا يزال هناك المسيحيون يعني بيفضلوا الدكتاتورية على الإسلام.
Well, you see, in Egypt, which is so different from Lebanon, you need to go back and see where mistakes were made. You know, when Anwar Sadat said, I am a Muslim president of a Muslim nation, it was a big mistake, because it's not just a Muslim nation, it is also a Copt Christian nation. And I think it was absolutely essential that Morsi said, I represent all Egyptians, Christians as well as Muslims. Certainly there was a habit developing in Egypt of Christians apparently voting for Ahmed Shafiq, not for Morsi. In other words, the election was dividing on sectarian lines because the Christians of Egypt do genuinely fear a sort of brotherhood type Islamicized government. But I think Morsi has gone as far as he can to prove that is not something he wants to do. It's not something he wants to see. So I think that insofar as one can, I think he has said the right things to the right people. You know, when there have been outbreaks of sectarian tension, they have become very violent, as we know, in Egypt. And I think that the one thing Egypt cannot take now, if it wants the International Monetary Fund to give it more money, is sectarian violence. So Morsi and everyone is saying all the right things. But what is very interesting in Egypt, when you talk about, you know, the fears of dictatorship, is the degree to which newspapers and television is still very free there. I was able to go on an hour's program on Hayat television in Cairo and say anything I wanted. And there was nobody lent on me, nobody said afterwards we can't show it. Compare this to Mubarak's period, of course.
ولكن هل اليوم نحن بخافوا على هذه المساحة من الحرية من بعد وصول مرسي؟ وبالتالي يعني لما بنحكي عن المسيحيين، من الذي يخيف المسيحيين أو بخوفهم من الإخوان المسلمين أو من الإسلام بشكل عام؟
Look, it is a sad fact in the Middle Eastern region that Christians in general tend to think they are protected by dictators. Hence the Christian support for Bashar al-Assad, the Christian support for Mubarak. Remember, Pope Shenouda in Egypt was still giving his support 2 days before Mubarak went. And it is not the same in Lebanon, of course, for obvious reasons. It's a very different country. But I think it's been very sad that we even find Christians automatically feeling that the dictator will protect them, when in fact their protection must be their own people, in other words, the people of their country. And clearly they have not been protected. As we know in Syria, Christians have been killed there.
روبرت، شبهت محمد مرسي لسعد زغلول. برأيك شو أوجه الشبه بين الاثنين؟ يعني خاصة أنه سعد زغلول من 85 سنة توفي، واليوم ليش استعدت هيدي الشخصية؟
Well, the reason was very simple. I've always admired Saad Zaghloul because of his conviction that he must fight for Egyptian independence against the English, which is of course my country. And I have a picture on my home here in Beirut of Saad Zaghloul, which I have framed in gold. So every morning when I get out of bed, I walk down the corridor and I see Saad Zaghloul, because he wanted a modern, secular Egypt. And so on the morning when the results of the Egyptian election were coming out, I decided to go and visit his home, which is run by the Ministry of Culture in Cairo. It's in a pretty dreadful state. It still has his 2 dead parrots at the top of the staircase. But it has a number of his wife's books. His wife, of course, was a very famous feminist in Egypt. And I wanted somehow to see if I could write a connection between the very modern, almost French ideas that Egyptian resistors had in 1919, 1920, 21. You know, we sent Saad Zarglou to exile in Malta, and then we brought him back to become prime minister, because we always put people in exile, we bring them back and make them prime minister. The French were very good at doing this in your country. Anyway, I wanted somehow to establish a connection between the very original Egyptian revolution against imperial rule by the British, and to make a connection between the British generals and the generals running Egypt now. And I said that if Saad Zarglou were to return, he'd probably think that General Tantawi, the chief of staff, looked a bit like General Allenby of the British Army. So I was being a little bit provocative to the Egyptians to see how they reacted to that.
ولكن الخطاب يعني محمد مرسي وخطاب الإخوان هل برأيك تغير؟
I think that, you know, power does one of 2 things to you when you become powerful. You either mature, you grow up and become a realist, or you live, to use the words of Muhammad Hussein Haykal, in a sea of quietness, totally cut off from your people. That's what Mubarak did. And I thought that by appearing in Tahrir and saying, look, I don't even have a flak jacket on, Morsi grew up. He was not in a sea of quietness. He wanted to go to the people. I have a friend of mine, a journalist in Egypt, who was extremely critical of Morsi, but who said to me on the telephone yesterday that he really thought he'd improved since he'd become the president in the last few days, that the man had actually become what he wanted to be. And he may turn out to be a much stronger person than we realized. He's not a great speaker. I think he speaks good English, actually, but in Arabic I can understand more than enough to know he's not a great speaker. But the last 2 speeches he's made have actually been very good. And if he doesn't want to be a dictator, which I don't think he does, and I don't think he could be now, I don't think there's not so much to fear from Egypt as we thought before. The danger, of course, is that in an election you say things and you can't keep your promises. But I don't see Egypt becoming an Islamist state or an Islamic republic. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's what Egyptians want. I don't think it's what they would tolerate.
فكرتك وصلت للغرب أم هذه فكرتك وحدك يعني؟
I don't speak on behalf of the West. Thank goodness. You know, no, I can remember some months ago, an American journalist was sitting on my balcony in Beirut and said, but Bob, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, it'll be an Islamic state, you see. And I said, you know, in the West, we have, in Germany, there's a Christian Democrat Party. In Italy, there's a Christian Democrat Party. But they're not going to restart the Third Crusade. It's just a title. And I said, what do you expect of the Middle East? I said, most of the people in the Middle East happen to be Muslims. They're not going to convert for the benefit of the West to some other religion. They're Muslims, that's it. Stop being so frightened about the word Islam and Muslim. I said, I live among these people every day for 36 years and it doesn't worry me. It should stop worrying you, you know. But I think the great fear in the West in general is that they, and this is about the Islamic world, is that in the West, Christians have pretty much lost their religion. Muslims have not lost their religion. They still believe in their faith. I'm now talking about we Westerners, we don't go to church very much anymore. All the churches in my country are empty most of the time. But my goodness, Muslims have not lost their faith. And I think there's a great deal of fear of the people who've kept their faith when we've lost ours. And I think this has something to do with the Western fears of the Middle East. They are not frightened, but apprehensive at a people who still believe that their religion must govern the way they behave in their lives. They don't always do that, but that they believe they should. And I think that seems very alien to us now, because most people lost their belief in God in the West in 1870, when we started believing in the nation state and human rights and democracy, you see. We replaced religion by democracy and human rights. And I think we were happier probably in the West with that situation. But I think it's very difficult for a Westerner to understand that Muslims have kept their faith and still really believe in God in a way we don't. And that, I think, has a lot to do with our attitude towards Arab countries.
على كل بدنا نعود لحوارنا. بدي انتقل من مصر إلى سوريا بعد التوقف مع فاصل قصير، وبدي أحكي عن